Most people believe the British Empire collapsed because of World War II. The common story is simple. Britain spent too much money fighting Germany, its economy became weak, and after the war it could no longer control its colonies. It sounds logical, and in many ways it is true. But it is only part of the story. The real reason the largest empire in history disappeared is far more surprising. Long before the war ended, cracks had already started spreading through the empire. Economic pressure, growing resistance, changing technology, and one major mistake after another slowly weakened Britain's global power. By the end of this video, you will see why the British Empire was already heading toward decline, why World War II only sped up the process, and how the fall of one empire completely changed the modern world. Stay with me until the end, because the final reason is one that many people never hear about. At its peak, the British Empire was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It controlled nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land and ruled hundreds of millions of people. There was a famous saying that the sun never set on the British Empire because somewhere in the world, the sun was always shining on British territory. Its influence stretched across every continent: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, large parts of Africa, islands in the Caribbean, territories in the Middle East, and many trading ports around Asia were all connected through one powerful empire. British ships carried goods across the oceans. British banks financed trade around the world. The Royal Navy protected sea routes, and London became the financial center of the global economy. For many years, this system seemed impossible to defeat. Britain had the strongest navy, one of the world's largest economies, and a huge network of colonies that supplied valuable resources. Cotton from India, rubber from Malaya, tea from Ceylon, gold from Africa, and countless other products flowed into British markets. In return, British factories sold manufactured goods across the empire. To many people living at the time, Britain's power looked permanent. But beneath the surface, problems were already growing. One of the biggest strengths of the empire slowly became one of its biggest weaknesses. The empire was simply too large. Protecting trade routes across thousands of miles required an enormous navy. Governing distant colonies required soldiers, administrators, judges, engineers, and government officials. Every new territory added more responsibility and more cost. As long as the economy kept growing, Britain could manage these expenses. But history rarely stands still. During the late 19th century, another country began rising at an incredible speed: Germany. After becoming a unified nation in 1871, Germany experienced an industrial boom. New factories appeared across the country. Steel production increased rapidly. German universities produced world-class scientists and engineers. Businesses invested heavily in modern technology. Within only a few decades, Germany became one of the strongest industrial nations in Europe. At almost the same time, the United States was growing even faster. Huge natural resources, a rapidly increasing population, and expanding industries allowed America to become an economic giant. Its factories produced steel, machinery, and consumer goods on a massive scale. New companies transformed transportation, electricity, and manufacturing. For the first time in more than a century, Britain was no longer the world's only industrial leader. Competition became much harder. British businesses now had to compete with cheaper and sometimes more advanced products coming from Germany and the United States. This change did not destroy the empire overnight, but it slowly reduced Britain's economic advantage. The world was changing faster than the empire could adapt. At the same time, another challenge appeared: nationalism. For many years, European empires believed they could rule distant lands forever, but education, newspapers, railways, and better communication allowed new political ideas to spread across the colonies. People started asking difficult questions. Why should another country rule us? Why should our resources benefit someone else? Why should decisions about our future be made thousands of miles away? These questions became powerful political movements. In India, educated leaders began demanding greater rights and eventually complete independence. Across Africa, local communities started organizing against colonial rule. In the Middle East, new nationalist movements questioned European control. Even in Ireland, which was much closer to Britain, demands for self-government continued to grow stronger. The British government often believed these movements could be controlled through reforms or stronger security. Sometimes that worked. Many times it did not. Every protest, every strike, and every political movement required attention, money, and manpower. Managing such a large empire became increasingly difficult. Then came another expensive challenge: military competition. During the early 20th century, European powers entered an arms race unlike anything seen before. Britain expanded its navy. Germany built more battleships. France increased military spending. Russia modernized its army. Governments believed stronger militaries would keep peace. Instead, they created greater tension. Keeping the Royal Navy larger than every rival fleet required huge amounts of money. New battleships were incredibly expensive. Each year, military budgets grew larger. That meant less money for other priorities. Still, British leaders believed sea power was essential. Without control of the oceans, the empire itself could not survive. Then, in 1914, everything changed. World War I began. The conflict lasted 4 years and involved millions of soldiers from around the world. Britain eventually emerged on the winning side, but victory came at an enormous cost. Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers were killed. The government borrowed huge amounts of money to finance the war. Industries shifted toward military production. Trade suffered. Although Britain had won the war, it was no longer as financially strong as before. Even more importantly, another country became the world's biggest lender: the United States. For years, Britain had invested money around the world. Now it increasingly depended on American loans. This marked the beginning of a major shift in global financial power. London remained important, but New York was rising quickly. The center of the world's economy was slowly moving across the Atlantic. Many people believed peace would allow Britain to recover. Instead, the years after World War I brought new economic problems: unemployment, political unrest, and growing pressure from independence movements across the empire. The warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Yet few people imagined that within only a few decades, the greatest empire in history would begin disappearing faster than almost anyone thought possible. And then came the event that changed everything once again: World War II. World War II is often described as the moment that destroyed the British Empire. In reality, the war did not create Britain's problems. It exposed them. The empire had already been carrying the weight of huge military costs, growing debts, and rising independence movements. The war simply pushed all of those problems to the breaking point. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain once again found itself fighting a global war. This conflict was even larger and more expensive than the first one. Britain had to defend Europe, North Africa, the Atlantic Ocean, the Middle East, and large parts of Asia. Every battle required ships, aircraft, tanks, fuel, food, and millions of workers. The cost was enormous. To keep fighting, Britain borrowed billions of dollars, mainly from the United States. American factories supplied weapons, vehicles, food, and industrial equipment through programs like Lend-Lease. These supplies helped Britain survive the war, but they also increased Britain's financial dependence on America. By 1945, Britain had won the war alongside its allies, but victory came with a heavy price. Large parts of the British economy were exhausted. Cities had been damaged by bombing. Industries needed rebuilding. Government debt had reached levels never seen before. For the first time in modern history, Britain was no longer the world's strongest financial power. That position now belonged to the United States. While Europe was rebuilding from destruction, American factories were producing more than ever. The U.S. economy had become the largest in the world. The American dollar slowly replaced the British pound as the most important international currency. This shift changed global politics forever. For more than 100 years, London had been the center of international finance. Now that center was moving to New York. At the same time, another superpower had emerged, the Soviet Union. Instead of one dominant empire, the world was becoming divided between two powerful countries with very different political systems. Britain suddenly found itself in a completely different world. It was no longer the nation setting the rules. It now had to compete with powers that were larger, richer, and militarily stronger. But money was only part of the problem. The people living inside the empire had also changed. Millions of soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many other colonies had fought during both world wars. They had sacrificed their lives alongside British forces. When the fighting ended, many asked an important question. If we were trusted to fight for freedom, why are we not trusted to govern ourselves? This question became impossible to ignore. Across the empire, independence movements gained new energy. Perhaps nowhere was this more important than India. India was often called the jewel of the British Empire. It had a huge population, valuable natural resources, important industries, and a central position in global trade. For generations, India had been one of Britain's greatest economic and strategic assets. But by the 1940s, demands for independence had become stronger than ever. Political leaders organized nationwide campaigns. Millions of ordinary people joined peaceful protests. Others believed stronger action was necessary. The British government understood that controlling India would now require far greater military force than before. After two exhausting world wars, Britain simply could not afford another long conflict. In 1947, India became independent. This was one of the biggest turning points in modern history, because once Britain lost India, the entire empire began changing rapidly. Other colonies carefully watched what had happened. If India could become independent, why not them? Within the next 2 decades, countries across Asia and Africa also gained independence. Burma, Ceylon, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Malaysia. One after another, Britain's colonial map became smaller. Some transitions were peaceful. Others were marked by violence and political conflict. Every colony had its own unique story, but together they showed one clear reality. The age of European empires was ending. Many British leaders hoped the empire could simply evolve into a new partnership through the Commonwealth. In many ways, that idea succeeded. Former colonies continued cooperating with Britain in trade, education, sports, and diplomacy, but politically, they were now independent nations. The empire itself was disappearing. Then came the event that convinced the entire world that Britain's time as a global superpower was over: the Suez Crisis. In 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced that the Suez Canal would be nationalized. For Britain, this was shocking. The canal was one of the world's most important trade routes. It connected Europe with Asia and carried huge amounts of oil. British leaders feared losing influence in the Middle East. Together with France and Israel, Britain launched a military operation against Egypt. At first, the invasion seemed successful, but something unexpected happened. The United States strongly opposed the operation. So did the Soviet Union. Britain suddenly realized something that would have been almost impossible to imagine only a few decades earlier. It could no longer act independently without American support. Facing international pressure and serious financial risks, Britain withdrew its forces. The Suez Crisis became a symbol of changing global power. Many historians believe this was the moment Britain finally accepted that it was no longer the world's leading empire. The United States had replaced it. From that point onward, British foreign policy became much more closely connected with Washington. Instead of leading the international system, Britain increasingly worked alongside its powerful ally. The empire had not disappeared in one single day. It had slowly transformed into something very different. Instead of ruling territories directly, Britain focused more on diplomacy, trade, finance, education, and international cooperation. London remained one of the world's leading financial centers. British universities continued attracting students from around the globe. English became the most widely used international language. British culture spread through literature, music, television, science, and technology. In many ways, Britain's influence continued. It simply looked different than before. This raises an important question. If Britain remained influential, can we really say the empire collapsed? The answer depends on how we define power. If power means controlling colonies with soldiers and governors, then yes, the empire collapsed. If power means cultural influence, financial services, education, diplomacy, and global partnerships, Britain remained one of the world's most important countries. Its empire ended, its influence did not. But one final reason explains why the British Empire could never have survived into the modern age. The world itself had changed. The final reason the British Empire collapsed was not only because Britain became weaker, it was also because the world no longer accepted the idea of empires. For hundreds of years, powerful European nations believed they had the right to control distant lands. They built colonies, collected taxes, controlled trade, and made political decisions for millions of people. During the 19th century, this system was accepted by many governments. But after World War II, that way of thinking began to disappear. People had just lived through one of the deadliest wars in history. Millions had died fighting against dictatorship and occupation. Across Asia and Africa, many people asked a simple question. If freedom was worth fighting for in Europe, why was it not worth protecting everywhere else? This question became impossible to answer. Around the world, independence movements became stronger than ever before. Young leaders organized political parties. Students held demonstrations. Workers demanded equal rights. Writers published books calling for freedom. Newspapers spread ideas much faster than before. Radio connected millions of people who had never heard these discussions before. For the first time, people living thousands of miles apart were inspired by each other's movements. One successful independence movement encouraged another. The process became impossible to stop. Another major change came in 1945 with the creation of the United Nations. The new organization promoted the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves. Although reality was often more complicated, the idea of self-determination gained support across the world. Colonial governments now faced growing international pressure. Holding colonies became politically difficult. It also became financially expensive. Britain had to ask an important question. Was it worth spending huge amounts of money to keep territories that no longer wanted British rule? For many leaders, the answer slowly became no. There was also another problem that received less attention: technology. During the 19th century, controlling overseas colonies depended on naval power. If Britain controlled the seas, it could move soldiers and supplies almost anywhere. But the 20th century changed warfare completely. Aircraft could cross oceans. Submarines threatened shipping routes. Long-range weapons made distant military bases more vulnerable. Maintaining a worldwide empire became far more complicated than it had been a century earlier. At the same time, television and newspapers changed public opinion. Events taking place in distant colonies could now be seen by people back in Britain. Reports of violence, protests, or military operations reached ordinary families much faster than before. Public opinion became another powerful force influencing government decisions. Many British citizens began questioning whether maintaining an empire was still the right path. Economic priorities were changing as well. Instead of spending money governing colonies, Britain needed to rebuild its own cities, hospitals, schools, roads, and industries after World War II. The country faced housing shortages. Factories needed modernization. Millions of returning soldiers needed jobs. These domestic challenges became far more important than defending distant territories. The British government gradually shifted its attention toward rebuilding life at home. Meanwhile, many former colonies were building their own futures. Some experienced rapid economic growth, others faced political instability and conflict. Independence did not solve every problem overnight, but it allowed these nations to make their own decisions and shape their own future. Britain also changed. Instead of trying to control territories directly, it focused on building partnerships. The Commonwealth became one example of this new relationship. Countries that had once been part of the empire continued cooperating in education, sports, diplomacy, and trade while remaining fully independent. This showed that influence no longer depended only on military control. Respect, cooperation, and shared interests became increasingly important. Looking back today, it is easy to imagine that the collapse of the British Empire was sudden. It was not. It happened over many decades. Every event added another small crack. Industrial competition reduced Britain's economic advantage. Two world wars drained its finances. The United States became the world's leading economic power. The Soviet Union emerged as another global superpower. Independence movements grew stronger across the colonies. International opinion shifted against colonial rule. Technology changed warfare. Economic priorities changed. None of these reasons alone ended the empire. Together, they transformed the world. Perhaps that is the most important lesson. Great powers rarely disappear because of one single event. They decline slowly. Their rivals grow stronger. The world changes. New technologies appear. New ideas spread. Economic power moves from one region to another. Eventually, the system that once seemed permanent becomes impossible to maintain. The British Empire followed that pattern. For more than 200 years, it shaped global trade, politics, law, language, and culture. Its influence reached nearly every corner of the world. Even today, many countries continue using legal systems, railways, government institutions, and the English language that developed during the period of British rule. Its legacy remains visible, but its political control is history. The story of the British Empire is therefore not simply the story of one country rising and falling. It is the story of how the world itself changed. It reminds us that no empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. Economic strength can fade, military power can be challenged, political ideas can evolve, and people who once accepted foreign rule may eventually demand the right to govern themselves. That is why the British Empire did not collapse because of one battle, one leader, or even one war. It ended because history was moving in a different direction.